The wedding march played, the guests stood, and the chapel doors swung open, but Lena never made it to the altar. Because Max wouldn't let her. Her golden retriever, the dog who'd slept beside her through every heartbreak, now barred her path with frantic whines, his paws planted stubbornly on her ivory train. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Cute, they thought. The dog doesn't want to let her go. But Lena saw the terror in Max's eyes. And then she saw the note, tucked in his collar, edges frayed as if chewed in desperation. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. Lena, if you're reading this, I couldn't be there to stop you myself. Daniel's handwriting. Daniel, who died 8 months ago. The scent of roses turned cloying. The organ music warped into a dizzying hum. Somewhere distant, Jason called her name, but all she heard was the thud of her own heartbeat as she read. Jason was driving the car that killed me. He was drunk. He ran. And he's going to ruin you too. The paper crumpled in her grip. Across the aisle, Jason's smile froze. He knew. She saw it. The way his knuckles whitened around his champagne flute, the sweat beading above his brow. Max growled low and lethal. And in that moment, Lena realized. Her dog hadn't just brought her a message. He'd brought her a warning from the grave. Lena had dreamed of this moment since she was a little girl, walking down the aisle in a flowing white gown, her father by her side, toward the man she loved. The sun shone through the chapel's stained glass windows, casting rainbow hues over the guests. Everything was perfect. The morning had been a whirlwind of last-minute details. Her bridesmaids fussing over the lace on her sleeves, her mother dabbing at happy tears, the florist adjusting the peonies in her bouquet. But now, standing at the back of the chapel, the world seemed to slow. The scent of roses and vanilla candles filled the air, and the soft murmur of the guests faded into a distant hum. Lena glanced at her father, who gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. His eyes, so much like her own, shimmered with emotion. "Ready, sweetheart?" he whispered. She nodded, her throat suddenly tight. The wedding march began, its familiar notes swelling through the chapel. Lena took a deep breath, her heart pounding in rhythm with the music. She lifted her gaze down the aisle, where Jason stood waiting for her, his smile warm and steady. He looked so handsome in his tuxedo, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression filled with love. This was it. The moment she had waited for. She took her first step. And then Max darted in front of her, blocking her path. Lena nearly stumbled, catching herself just in time. A ripple of laughter spread through the guests. "Max, not now," she whispered, trying to nudge him aside. But Max didn't move. He stood firm, his golden fur ruffled and his tail stiff. His brown eyes locked onto hers, pleading. Lena frowned. This wasn't like him. Max was the most well-behaved dog she had ever known, always gentle, always obedient. He had been her constant companion for years, her shadow through heartbreaks and triumphs. He had even been part of the wedding planning, trotting happily beside her during dress fittings and cake tastings. So why was he stopping her now? She reached down to stroke his head, hoping to calm him. "Come on, boy," she murmured. "You can walk with me, okay?" But Max whined, a low, urgent sound that sent a chill down her spine. Then, before she could react, he nudged her hand insistently with his nose, as if trying to show her something. That was when she noticed it. A folded piece of paper tucked into his collar. Lena's breath caught. The guests were still watching, some with amusement, others with growing curiosity. Jason's smile had faltered slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the paper. It was slightly damp. Had Max been carrying it in his mouth? And the edges were frayed as though he had been holding onto it for a while. She unfolded it carefully. The moment she saw the handwriting, her stomach dropped. It was Daniel's. Her childhood best friend, the man who had loved her silently for years, the man who had died in a car accident just weeks after her engagement. Her vision blurred. "Lena," the note began. "If you're reading this, I couldn't be there to stop you myself. But I couldn't let you marry him without knowing the truth." Her pulse roared in her ears. The music had stopped. The chapel was utterly silent. She forced herself to keep reading. Jason was driving the car that night. He was drunk. He ran the red light. And when he realized what he'd done, he ran. The words burned into her mind. The police report was buried. His family has connections. But I found out. And I couldn't let you. The note ended abruptly as though Daniel hadn't had time to finish. Lena's hands shook so badly the paper nearly slipped from her grasp. No, this couldn't be real. She looked up, her gaze locking onto Jason's. His expression had changed, his smile gone, his face pale. He knew. He knew what the note said. A sob tore from her throat. Max pressed against her leg, steadying her. And then, without a word, she turned and ran. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd like a wave crashing against shore. All eyes were fixed on Lena and the golden retriever stubbornly blocking her path. The wedding march had faltered, the organist's fingers hovering uncertainly over the keys. Max had never been disobedient. He was her loyal companion, always gentle and well-trained. He'd been to countless dress rehearsals, sitting patiently at the altar with Jason during practice runs. Yet today, his entire body trembled with an urgency Lena had never seen before. Something's wrong, Lena murmured, her voice barely audible over the growing whispers. She gathered her voluminous skirts and knelt to his level, uncaring of the dirt that might stain her pristine gown. The moment her knees touched the floor, Max released a shuddering whine that made her blood run cold. He grabbed the hem of her dress in his teeth with surprising gentleness, tugging insistently back toward the dressing room they'd just left. His brown eyes held a depth of emotion that seemed almost human, pleading, warning, begging her to understand. Her heart pounded against her ribcage. Why is he acting like this? Then she saw it, a folded piece of paper tucked haphazardly into Max's collar, its edges slightly damp with dog saliva. The sight sent an inexplicable chill down her spine. Lena reached with trembling fingers, her French manicure catching the light as she extracted the note. The paper felt heavy in her hands, though it was just a single sheet. Around her, the world seemed to hold its breath. Her bridesmaids exchanged confused glances, her mother half rose from her seat, and at the altar, Jason took an involuntary step forward, his smile frozen in place. The moment Lena unfolded the note, time stopped. She recognized the handwriting instantly, the slightly slanted E's, the dramatic loops on the G's. It was Daniel's. Daniel, who had been her best friend since third grade. Daniel, who had kissed her for the first time behind the bleachers junior year. Daniel, who had died 8 months ago in a hit-and-run accident. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. Lena, if you're reading this, I couldn't be there to stop you myself. But I couldn't let you marry him without knowing the truth. Jason was driving the car that night. He was drunk. He ran the red light at Elm and Fifth. When he realized what he'd done, when he saw it was me, he drove away. The police report was buried. His father pulled strings. But I need you to know before you. The note ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. A dark stain in the corner might have been coffee, or blood. Lena's breath came in short, ragged gasps. The edges of her vision darkened as the implications crashed over her. Jason, her charming, dependable Jason, had killed Daniel. Had left him dying in the street, had lied to her face every single day since. A strangled sound escaped her throat. The note fluttered from her numb fingers, floating to the ground like a falling leaf. Max immediately snatched it up, guarding it between his paws as if protecting crucial evidence. At the altar, Jason's face had gone ashen. He took another step forward, then stopped when Max growled, a low, dangerous sound no one had ever heard from the gentle retriever before. Lena, Jason called, his voice cracking. Whatever that says, it's not. She didn't let him finish. With strength she didn't know she possessed, Lena gathered her skirts and ran. The chapel doors swung open with a crash as she burst into the sunlight, Max at her heels. Behind her, chaos erupted. Her mother's shrill cry, Jason's furious shouting, the confused babble of 200 guests. But all Lena could hear was the blood roaring in her ears and the frantic rhythm of her own footsteps against the pavement. She didn't stop running until she reached the old oak tree at the edge of the church property, the same tree where she and Daniel had carved their initials as teenagers. Sobs racked her body as she collapsed against the rough bark, her wedding dress tearing on the roots. Max pressed against her side, his warm body a steady presence as the world crumbled around her. He dropped the note at her feet, and then rested his head in her lap with a quiet whine. Lena stared at the crumpled paper, the words now imprinted on her soul. How had this note reached her? Who had given it to Max? Daniel was dead. Had someone else discovered the truth? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of running footsteps. Jason appeared, his tuxedo disheveled, his face a mask of desperation. "Lena, please," he gasped, reaching for her. "You have to let me explain." Max moved faster than she'd ever seen. In a flash of golden fur, he positioned himself between them, teeth bared. The message was clear. "You won't touch her." Jason recoiled. "Jesus, call off your damn dog." Lena found her voice then, and it came out colder than she'd ever heard it. "Explain then, Jason. Explain how my best friend's handwriting is telling me you murdered him." The way his face twisted, the guilt, the fear, the calculation, told her everything she needed to know. The truth had been delivered to her on her wedding day. By a dog who refused to let her make the biggest mistake of her life. Jason's hands flexed at his sides, his knuckles white. "It wasn't like that," he said, the words tumbling out too fast. "We were both drinking that night, Lena. It was an accident. A terrible, tragic accident." Lena felt something inside her fracture. "You told me you were home that night. You comforted me at Daniel's funeral." Her voice broke. "You held me while I cried for him." The memory made her physically ill. She could still feel Jason's arms around her, his whispered promises that everything would be okay. All while he knew. He knew. Max's growl deepened as Jason took another step forward. The usually docile dog looked ready to attack, his muscles coiled like springs. "Stay back," Lena warned. Jason ignored her, his eyes wild. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. My father's Senate campaign. A scandal like that would have ruined everything." His voice took on a pleading tone. "I love Daniel too, Lena. Do you think I wanted this?" A hysterical laugh bubbled up in Lena's throat. "You loved him? You left him to die in the street." The words hung between them, ugly and irreparable. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Someone must have called the police when she fled the chapel. Jason's expression darkened. "You'll regret this," he hissed, all pretense of remorse vanishing. "That note proves nothing. My family owns this town. Who do you think they'll believe? A grieving fiancé having a breakdown, or me?" Before Lena could respond, Max lunged, not to bite, but to snatch something from Jason's pocket. The dog retreated quickly, dropping a buzzing smartphone at Lena's feet. The screen was lit with an incoming call from Dad. But what caught Lena's eye was the notification preview. "Jason, the PI found the witness. We need to." Her blood turned to ice. Max had just given her the evidence she needed. Lena moved on instinct. She grabbed the phone just as Jason realized his mistake. His roar of fury was cut short as Max's body slammed him, knocking him off balance. "Good boy," Lena cried, already running toward the church parking lot. Her heels sank into the grass, so she kicked them off, running barefoot toward her car. Behind her, Jason shouted obscenities, but Max harried him like a sheepdog with a rogue lamb, darting in to nip at his ankles whenever he got too close. Lena fumbled with the car keys hidden in her garter. The silver BMW chirped as she unlocked it. She threw herself into the driver's seat just as Jason broke free from Max's interference. "Lena, don't do this," he screamed, pounding on her window as she started the engine. Her tear-streaked face turned toward him one last time. "You killed Daniel," she said, her voice eerily calm, "and now you're going to pay for it." As she peeled out of the parking lot, she caught sight of Max in the rearview mirror, the heroic dog sprinting after her car before leaping gracefully into the back seat through the open window. The last thing she saw was Jason collapsing to his knees in the middle of the road, his perfect life unraveling as the police cars finally rounded the corner. Lena pressed the accelerator, the wedding dress constricting her movements. She'd go straight to the news station. To the state police, to anyone who would listen. And she had two irrefutable witnesses, a dog that refused to let her marry a murderer, and a dead man's final message delivered in the nick of time. With trembling hands, Lena unfolded the note. The moment she recognized the handwriting, her breath caught in her throat like a trapped bird. The elegant loops of the L in her name, the slight slant to the right, she'd know it anywhere. She had seen it 1,000 times before, scribbled in the margins of her high school notebooks, penned in birthday cards, written hastily on coffee-stained napkins during late-night study sessions. Daniel. Her fingers shook so violently the paper fluttered like a dying leaf. The scent of ink and something faintly metallic, could that be blood? Rose from the page. Lena. If you're reading this, I couldn't be there to stop you myself. But I couldn't let you marry him without knowing the truth. A sob tore from her lips. Around her, the chapel had dissolved into chaos. Guests whispering, her mother crying out, the wedding planner frantically signaling the musicians to stop playing. But all Lena could see were those words, searing themselves into her mind. Daniel, her childhood best friend, the boy who'd taught her to ride a bike, the man who'd kissed her for the first time under the bleachers junior year. The one who'd shown up at her dorm room at 2 a.m. with ice cream when her first college boyfriend broke her heart, the soul who'd looked into her eyes the night before her engagement and whispered, "It should have been me," before walking away forever. And who had died 2 weeks later in a hit and run on Elm Street. Her vision blurred as she forced herself to keep reading. Jason was driving the car that night. He was drunk. I saw him swerve through the intersection at Elm and 5th. I recognized his dad's black Mercedes. I tried to get out of the way, but the handwriting grew shakier here, the letters sprawling as if written in haste or pain. When he realized it was me, he got out. Just for a second. I'll never forget the look on his face, not horror, Lena. Calculation. Then he drove away and left me there. A wet spot on the paper might have been a tear, Daniel's or her own, she couldn't tell. The paramedic said I wouldn't make it to the hospital. So I'm giving this to Dr. Ruiz, you remember my neighbor, the vet? She promised to get it to Max if anything. If I? The next words were nearly illegible, the pen dragging. Don't marry him, Lee. You deserve the truth. You always. The note ended there, abruptly, as if the pen had fallen from lifeless fingers. A high-pitched ringing filled Lena's ears. The world tilted dangerously. Strong hands caught her shoulders. Her father's, she realized distantly. Lena, sweetheart, what is it? She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her gaze lifted to the altar where Jason stood frozen, his perfect groom's facade cracking to reveal something feral beneath. Their eyes met, and in that instant she knew. The way his pupils dilated. The sweat beading on his upper lip, the barely perceptible tremor in his hands. He knew. He'd always known. Max growled low in his throat, the sound vibrating through Lena's legs where the dog pressed against her. The golden retriever had positioned himself squarely between her and Jason, his hackles raised in a way she'd never seen before. Someone calls an ambulance, a voice shouted from the pews. She's going into shock. But Lena wasn't collapsing from shock. She was awakening from it. With sudden clarity, a dozen fractured memories snapped into focus. Jason forgetting to pick her up from the hospital the night Daniel died. Jason's father, the powerful Senator Hartman, suddenly taking an interest in her career, fast-tracking her dream job at his law firm. The way Jason had insisted on adopting Max from Daniel's grieving parents just weeks after the funeral. He should be with family, Jason had said smoothly. Now Max bared his teeth at his supposed owner, a snarl rippling from his chest. Lena's fingers tightened around the note. "You monster," she whispered. The words barely carried past the first pew, but Jason flinched as if she'd screamed them. He took a step forward, hands outstretched in that infuriatingly reasonable gesture he always used when gaslighting her. "Lena, whatever that says, it's not." Max lunged. Not to bite, but to snatch. His teeth closed around Jason's cufflink, yanking hard. The expensive silver accessory clattered to the floor, revealing a jagged scar beneath Jason's sleeve. A scar Lena had never seen before. A scar that matched the description in the police report. Driver-sustained lacerations from broken windshield glass. The room erupted. Lena's mother screamed. Jason's best man grabbed for Max. A guest in the third row was already filming on her phone. And Lena ran. She hit the chapel doors at full speed, her wedding dress tearing on the handle. Summer sunlight blinded her as she stumbled down the steps, Max bounding ahead like a golden guide. "Lena, stop." Jason's voice chased her across the lawn. "You don't understand what you're—" She didn't look back. Her bare feet slapped against the hot pavement as she raced toward the vintage Mustang Daniel had helped her restore, the car Jason had always hated. Max leapt through the open window before she even had the door fully open. The engine roared to life just as Jason emerged from the church, his tuxedo jacket flapping behind him like broken wings. Their eyes met through the windshield, his filled with fury, hers with a grief so vast it threatened to swallow the world. She stomped on the gas. As the Mustang peeled away, two things sat on the passenger seat: Daniel's damning note, and the phone Max had stolen from Jason, its screen now lit with an incriminating text thread. "Senator Hartman, today 10:14 a.m. The witness from Elm St. is talking to the Tribune. We need to handle this before the wedding." Lena's hands tightened on the wheel. Somewhere behind her, sirens wailed. And in the back seat, Max panted happily, his tail thumping against the leather. The Mustang ate up the highway miles as Lena drove on autopilot, her mind racing faster than the engine. Beside her, the stolen phone buzzed incessantly, Jason calling, then his father, then an unknown number with a DC area code. Max whined, nudging her elbow with his wet nose. "I know, boy," she murmured, stroking his head without taking her eyes off the road. "We'll figure this out." Her own phone, tucked in the garter sheet ironically labeled something blue, had 17 missed calls from her mother and a string of increasingly frantic texts from her bridesmaids. She ignored them all, instead dialing the only number that mattered now. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Dr. Ruiz's office, it's Lena Carter," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to speak to the doctor. Right now." A pause, then, "Lena, she's been expecting your call." The vet came on the line immediately. "You got the note?" It wasn't a question. Lena's throat tightened. "You knew. This whole time you knew." Dr. Ruiz's sigh crackled through the speaker. "Daniel made me promise. Said if anything happened to him, I was to give the letter to Max only if you were still planning to marry Jason." A bitter chuckle. "That dog has been guarding my filing cabinet for 8 months. A fresh wave of grief crashed over Lena. Max had known. Had been waiting all this time to save her. "Why didn't you go to the police?" she demanded. "With what proof? A dying man's scribbled note." Dr. Ruiz's voice dropped. "But there's more. After Daniel died, I pulled security footage from my clinic across Elm Street. The cameras caught the accident." Lena nearly swerved off the road. "You have video? Enough to see the license plate, enough to see Jason get out, look at Daniel, and drive away." The vet's next words sent chills down Lena's spine. "I've been waiting for you to call. The file's ready to send to the FBI? But only if you're ready to burn their world down." Lena glanced at Max in the rearview mirror. The dog gazed back at her with Daniel's same steady courage. "Do it," she said. By the time Lena pulled into the dusty parking lot of the Chicago Tribune, her dress was ruined, her makeup streaked, and her heart pounding like a war drum. The young reporter who met her at the door did a double take. Congratulations?" Lena thrust Jason's phone and Daniel's note at her. "Senator Hartman's son left my best friend to die on Elm Street last year. I have proof." 2 hours later, Lena sat in a conference room surrounded by lawyers and journalists, Max curled protectively at her feet. On the table between them played Dr. Ruiz's security footage, grainy but unmistakable, of Jason's Mercedes mowing down Daniel before speeding away. "It's over," the Tribune's editor murmured as federal agents swarmed Hartman's downtown office. But as Lena stroked Max's fur, watching the sunset paint the sky the same orange as Daniel's favorite hoodie, she knew this was just the beginning. Somewhere out there Jason was running. And she had a very good dog who knew how to hunt. Daniel's letter revealed a secret he had discovered too late. Her fiancé, Jason, had been involved in the accident that took Daniel's life. It wasn't just a tragic coincidence, it was a cover-up. He was drunk, Lena. He fled the scene. The police report was buried. Please, don't marry him. The room spun. Lena's knees buckled as she clutched Max for support, her fingers tangling in his golden fur as the world tilted on its axis. The scent of roses and candle wax that had seemed so beautiful moments ago now choked her, cloying and suffocating. All the little inconsistencies about Jason's behavior, the evasiveness, the sudden mood swings, clicked into place like the final damning turn of a lock. The way he had refused to talk about the accident, dismissing her grief with a curt, "It's painful for me too, you know." The nights he had come home smelling of whiskey, his temper flaring when she asked where he'd been. The way his father, Senator Hartman, had personally handled the arrangements after Daniel's death, insisting the police had no leads. "Some drunk driver," Jason had murmured at the funeral, his hand squeezing hers. Probably didn't even realize what he'd done. The hypocrisy of it burned like acid in her throat. Around her, the chapel had erupted into chaos. Guests whispered behind their hands, their shocked faces blurring in Lena's vision. Her mother was crying, her father's face ashen as he tried to steady her. At the altar, Jason stood frozen, his perfect facade cracking. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white around the stem of his untouched champagne glass. And then their eyes met. For the first time, Lena saw the truth laid bare in his gaze. Not love, not remorse, but fear. Raw, desperate fear. Max growled, low and warning, his body tense against her legs. "Lena," Jason called out, his voice too smooth, too controlled. He took a step forward, his smile strained. "Whatever that note says, it's not what you think. Let's talk about this." She didn't let him finish. With shaking hands she held up the letter, her voice carrying through the stunned silence of the chapel. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" The words tore from her, raw and ragged. "Did you think Daniel would just let me marry the man who killed him?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Jason's face went slack with panic. "That's insane, you can't possibly believe." "You were driving the car that night," she screamed, the words ripping through the chapel like gunfire. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Jason's mask shattered. His expression twisted, anger, desperation, something almost feral, and he lunged forward. Not toward her, but toward Max, his hands outstretched to grab the note. The dog reacted instantly. With a snarl, Max leapt between them, his teeth bared. Jason recoiled, stumbling back into the groomsman, who caught him with equal parts shock and hesitation. "Call the police," Lena said, her voice steadier now. She didn't take her eyes off Jason. "Call them now." Murmurs of assent rose around her, but Jason's laugh cut through them, sharp, mocking. "Really?" He straightened his tie, his composure slipping back into place like a well-practiced lie. "You're going to accuse me based on some scribbled note from a dead man?" He shook his head, the picture of wounded disbelief. "Lena, you're hysterical. You're not thinking clearly." The condescension in his tone made her blood boil. But then, Max barked, sharp and insistent before anyone could react. He darted to the front pew where Jason's jacket was draped. With a single, purposeful motion, he clamped his teeth around the fabric and yanked. Something clattered to the floor. The phone. Jason's phone. Lena moved before he could, snatching it up just as the screen lit up with a new notification. "Senator Hartman, the witness is talking. We need to handle this now." Her breath caught. Jason paled. "Lena." She unlocked the phone with the passcode she'd seen him use 1,000 times. His birthday, because of course it was, and opened the messages. What she found made her stomach turn. Dozens of texts between Jason and his father, spanning months. "The police report is taken care of. But if anyone digs too deep, they won't. The only witness was some homeless guy. No one will believe him. The Tribune is sniffing around Elm Street again. We need to discredit that witness before he talks." Lena's hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the phone. It was all there. The cover-up, the lies, the cold, calculated way they had buried the truth. And then, the final nail in Jason's coffin, a photo. A grainy security still of the accident, time-stamped the night Daniel died. Jason's black Mercedes. The broken glass. And Daniel's body, lying motionless on the pavement. A sob wrenched itself from Lena's chest. Jason saw the photo. Saw her face. And in that moment he knew it was over. His expression darkened, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You ruin me and I swear to God you'll regret it. The threat hung in the air, ugly and absolute. But Lena wasn't afraid anymore. She turned to the crowd, holding the phone aloft. Does anyone here work for the press? A woman in the third row stood immediately, phone already recording. I'm a reporter for the Chicago Sun. Lena handed her the phone. Then you're going to want to see this. Jason moved, fast, but Max was faster. The dog lunged, knocking Jason off balance just as the chapel doors burst open. Police officers flooded in, their radios crackling. Lena didn't wait to see them arrest Jason. She couldn't. Because as the truth finally unraveled around her, all she could think about was Daniel. Daniel, who had loved her enough to send her this warning from beyond the grave. Daniel, who had died alone on a cold street because of Jason's cowardice. Daniel, who had given her one last gift, Max. The dog pressed against her side now, warm and solid, as the officers led Jason away in handcuffs. And as Lena buried her face in Max's fur, she made a silent promise. She wouldn't just survive this. She'd make sure the world knew what Jason Hartman had done. No matter what it took. The police station was a blur of fluorescent lights and murmured questions. Lena sat on a stiff plastic chair, a blanket draped over her torn wedding dress, while detectives took her statement. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on her toes as if anchoring her to the present. Across the room, Jason glared at her through the glass partition of the interrogation room, his expensive lawyer already whispering in his ear. But Lena wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the evidence bag on the table, Daniel's note now sealed beside Jason's phone. Miss Carter, the lead detective said gently, are you sure you're up for this right now? Lena lifted her chin. I'm sure. She told them everything. The accident, the cover-up, the text. And when they asked how she'd gotten the phone, she simply pointed to Max. The detective raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. By the time they finished, the sun had set, and the station was buzzing with reporters clamoring for a statement. Senator Hartman had been arrested an hour earlier, caught attempting to flee the city on a private jet. It was over. Or so she thought. As Lena stepped outside into the cool night air, a familiar voice called her name. Lena, wait. She turned to see Dr. Ruiz hurrying toward her, her lab coat flapping in the breeze. The vet's face was flushed, her eyes bright with urgency. I saw the news, she panted. I came as soon as I could. There's something you need to see. From her bag she pulled a USB drive. Security footage from my clinic, she explained. From the night Daniel died. It's not much, but it's him. It's his last moments. Lena's breath hitched. Did she want to see that? Did she need to? Max nudged her hand, his tail giving a single, solemn wag. She took the drive. Back at her apartment. Their apartment, though Jason would never step foot in it again. Lena plugged the USB into her laptop with trembling fingers. The video was grainy, the angle awkward, but it was unmistakable. Elm Street. The screech of brakes. The sickening thud of impact. And then, Daniel lying broken on the asphalt. But he wasn't alone. A figure stumbled from the car. Jason, his face bloody, his movements unsteady. He stared at Daniel for a long, horrible moment. Then he got back in the car. And drove away. Lena pressed a hand to her mouth, her tears falling freely now. But then, something unexpected. Daniel stirred. With agonizing slowness he reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. The screen illuminated his face, pale, bloodied, but determined. He typed something. Then, with his last ounce of strength, he tucked the phone back into his jacket just as the camera feed cut out. Lena's breath caught. That text, that last text. Had it been for her? She would never know. But as Max climbed onto the couch beside her, resting his head in her lap, Lena allowed herself to cry, for Daniel, for herself, for the future they'd lost. And when the tears finally stopped, she made a vow. She would live. Not just for her, but for him. The guests stared in stunned silence as Lena turned toward Jason. His face paled when he saw the letter in her hand, his carefully constructed mask of charm crumbling like wet sand. The organ had stopped playing. The whispers had died. Even the rustle of silk and taffeta seemed to freeze as every eye in the chapel fixed on them. You knew, she whispered, the words slicing through the silence like a knife. All this time you knew. Jason's throat worked as he swallowed hard, his gaze darting from the note to the guests to the open chapel doors, calculating, always calculating. For a wild moment, Lena thought he might deny it. Might laugh it off as some cruel joke, might gaslight her right there in front of 200 witnesses. But then his shoulders slumped. His silence was all the confirmation she needed. A single tear traced down Lena's cheek as she turned away from the altar, away from the flowers, the vows, the future she'd almost had. Max pressed against her side, his warm bulk steadying her as she took her first step toward the aisle. Then the second. Then the third. The guests parted like the Red Sea, some reaching out to touch her arm, others openly weeping. Her mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. Lena. But Lena didn't stop. Couldn't stop. With Max by her side, she walked out of the chapel, not as a bride, but as a woman who had narrowly escaped a life built on lies. Sunlight blinded her as she emerged onto the church steps. The June air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and distant rain. Somewhere beyond the manicured hedges, a car horn blared. Life went on. Lena's knees gave out. She crumpled onto the lawn, her voluminous wedding dress pooling around her like melted wax. Max immediately shoved his head under her hand, whining softly as she buried her fingers in his fur. "I'm okay," she whispered, to him, to herself, to the ghost she hoped was watching. "We're okay." But they weren't. Not really. Because Daniel was still dead. And Jason. A commotion at the chapel doors snapped her head up. Jason stood framed in the arched doorway, his tuxedo rumpled, his hair disheveled. For a heartbeat, they just stared at each other across the distance. Then his expression twisted into something ugly. "You'll regret this," he spat, taking a step forward. Max growled, the sound vibrating through Lena's palm where it rested on his back. Jason hesitated. And that's when the sirens started. At first they were distant, a warbling echo from the direction of downtown. But they grew louder quickly, joined by the screech of tires and the static crackle of police radios. Jason's head whipped toward the street just as 3 squad cars careened into the church parking lot, lights flashing. Lena blinked. How? Then she saw her bridesmaid, Emily, standing on the chapel steps with her phone clutched to her chest. Their eyes met and Emily mouthed 2 words, "I called them." Jason bolted. He took off around the side of the church, his dress shoes slipping on the damp grass. For a moment, Lena thought he might actually escape, might disappear into the maze of downtown alleys and emerge later with another lie, another excuse. But Max was faster. With a bark that sounded almost triumphant, the golden retriever launched himself after Jason, moving like a shot across the lawn. Lena watched, breath caught in her throat, as her dog, Daniel's dog, closed the distance in seconds. Max didn't bite. Didn't attack. He just herded. Like the world's most determined sheepdog, Max cut Jason off at every turn, nipping at his heels, blocking his path, until the police finally cornered him against the church's brick wall. The arrest was quick. Clinical. As the officers read Jason his rights, Lena finally let herself breathe. It was over. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of police stations, news cameras, and shocked phone calls. Dr. Ruiz's security footage made national headlines. The texts between Jason and his father were leaked online. And the homeless witness Jason had dismissed, a Vietnam vet named Mr. Riley, gave an emotional interview to the Chicago Tribune about what he'd seen that night. By the time the sun rose on the 3rd day, Senator Hartman had resigned, Jason was in jail awaiting trial, and Lena stood in front of Daniel's grave for the first time since the funeral. The grass was freshly trimmed, the headstone polished to a shine. Someone, Daniel's parents probably, had left a bouquet of blue hydrangeas at the base. His favorite. Max sat quietly beside her, his tail thumping once against the ground as Lena knelt in the grass. "I'm sorry it took me so long to visit," she whispered, tracing the letters of his name carved into the stone. I think part of me didn't want to believe you were really gone." A breeze ruffled her hair, carrying the scent of rain and earth and something faintly citrusy, like the cheap cologne Daniel had always worn. Lena smiled through her tears. She told him everything then, about the wedding, about Max, about the note that had saved her from the worst mistake of her life. When she finally ran out of words, she pressed her forehead to the cool stone and just breathed. Max whined softly, nudging her hand with his nose. "I know, boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "It's time to go." But before she stood, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a single item, the silver cufflink Max had torn from Jason's sleeve during the confrontation. She placed it carefully beside the hydrangeas. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered. And somewhere she liked to think he was smiling. The dog park was bustling on Saturday morning, a cacophony of barks, laughter, and the occasional shouted command. Lena leaned against the fence, her coffee warming her hands as she watched Max romp with a pack of particularly enthusiastic Pomeranians. "You spoil him," a voice said beside her. Lena turned to smile at Mr. Riley, the witness, now a dear friend, as he offered her a powdered donut from his weekly bakery run. "He deserves it." Mr. Riley chuckled, watching as Max gently herded the smaller dogs away from a mud puddle. "That dog's a hero." Lena's smile softened. "Yeah, he is." Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another email from the publisher about her memoir, another interview request, another message from one of the countless women who'd reached out after Jason's trial to share their own stories. But for now, she just sipped her coffee and watched her dog play. Somewhere beyond the trees, a shadow moved, just a trick of the light, probably. But for a moment, Lena could have sworn she saw a familiar figure in a ratty college hoodie, hands shoved in his pockets, smile crooked and warm. Then the wind shifted and he was gone. But that was okay. Because Lena wasn't alone. And she never would be again.